Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me come around today and talk a little bit about renewable energy and specifically wind energy and transmission. And a while ago, I think if you were in the transmission industry, people would look at you at you meet somebody at a cocktail party, they would politely go look for another drink. But today, transmission is, people understand that transmission is really the key to unlocking the potential of renewable energy. So it's great to have a big crowd out taking an interest in this topic. And you can go to a cocktail party now and say you work in transmission and people don't immediately dash for the exit. So it's an exciting time to be involved in renewable energy and specifically this part of the value chain. So what I thought I'd do is just walk y'all through where we've been in wind energy over the last decade or so, where we're headed, talk a little bit about cost, because everybody wants to know, everybody says, okay, I get it, I get the need for clean energy, what is this going to cost, and what do the economics of this look like? And then talk a little bit about what we're doing nationally and what we're doing here in Arkansas as well. So wind energy is coming of age. I got in the wind business in the late 90s. In 2000, just to give you some sense, we had less than 1,000 megawatts of wind energy installed in the United States. Now think of 1 megawatt as the turbines that you see coming out of Jonesboro or the blades coming out of town here. Each of those machines is around 2 megawatts, and each megawatt can provide enough electricity for about 300 homes. So in around 2000, we were producing enough electricity with wind energy to meet the needs. We had around 2,000 in California, so 3,000 around. Less than 1 million homes in America would have been, their electricity needs would have been met by wind energy. And today, we're at over 34,000. We'll hit around 40,000 when the numbers come in for 2010. So that's enough electricity for the needs of about 12 million U.S. homes. So, and at the same time, as you see on the left, that's a picture from California around the Palm Springs area, and those were the wind turbines of the day. Today, turbines are much bigger, 2 megawatt size, and the technology has really come of age. So what's driving this move toward more wind energy? The main, really you can segment this between two things, one on the supply side and the other on the demand side. On the supply side, we're seeing tremendous technological improvements so that wind energy in 1985 would have cost 25 cents a kilowatt hour, and today we're well under 5 cents. And the other is tax benefits. If you build a wind farm for 10 years, you will get a tax credit of 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And we'll come back to the impact of that in just a minute. So a 2-cent federal incentive. And then on the demand side, really beginning with the legislation that Governor Bush signed in 1999 in Texas, where the legislature enacted and the governor signed a bill that said we're going to get a small but increasing percentage of our electricity from clean energy sources. That really kicked off a move around the country toward this thing called renewable portfolio standards, which basically say that we as a state will get an increasing percentage of our electricity from clean sources. And because wind is pretty much the cheapest source of renewable energy out there, it has taken the lion's share of the market that was created through this inelastic demand. The other drivers is people understand the energy security imperatives around renewables, and people also understand that if you want to make a dent in carbon, the electric sector is a pretty good place to start. And so that between 1997 and 2010, we had renewable portfolio standards enacted in almost 30 states. But this is still a relatively small part of the electric power equation. As you all know, electricity is part of the overall energy equation, and renewables are a small part of that. So we're talking about an industry that today is about 3.6, by the end of the year will be north of 4% in wind. It's a small part of, but it's getting bigger, and we'll see that in a second. The interesting thing about energy is any percentage of anything in energy is a really big number. So the tens of billions that we've seen invested in wind energy are providing a little over 2% of our electricity supply today. That's going up fairly dramatically. Pretty much bipartisan agreement on this topic that we need to do more with respect to renewable energy. President Bush pushed it, President Obama pushed it, and we think that that support will be, if to the extent that, you know, Congress does anything at all in the next few years, they're likely to agree on this. Whether or not they can parlay that agreement into action, well, I guess we could spend a lot of time here at the Clinton Institute trying to answer that question, but I won't get too far into that. So what this has meant is you know, when I first got in the business, basically you'd land an agreement to sell power. You would call up folks in Denmark and say, hey, we're going to need some of these machines. Can you put them together? We place an order, and the machines would show up sometime later. What happened over the last 10 years, we had on and off policy support, particularly on the tax incentive side for renewables. And we'd have a tax credit for 2 years, it would lapse for 6 months, then it'd come back for 3, and so on. The Europeans looked at that and they said, you know, we don't really understand you guys over there in the US, like you want renewables, but you don't, and you have the tax credit and then you don't. So for a long time, they were reluctant to invest in manufacturing facilities, and that was probably the biggest downside of on and off policy support around wind energy. But after a while, they said, okay, we understand you guys are serious, but the way you sort of act on your serious intent here is somewhat erratic, but we get it. So around 4 years ago, we started to see a lot of manufacturing investment around wind energy in the U.S. These are big, heavy pieces of equipment. It makes a lot of sense to manufacture them close to where they're going to be used. Arkansas has been a big beneficiary of this trend. You guys are, by accidents of geography, what you have is it's not all that windy in Arkansas, as you know, but to your west and to your north and even to your northeast, you have the confluence of good wind resources and available transmission capacity, and you have a place where you, with a skilled labor force that is accustomed to making equipment like this. You overlay that with the transportation infrastructure that Arkansas enjoys, and pretty business-friendly environment. All those things have come together so that in Arkansas you've seen Mitsubishi setting up shop in Fort Smith, Nordex in Jonesboro, LM here in Little Rock. So a lot of manufacturing has started to take place, and you see that in states that offer all these different advantages. So it's not it's not one particular thing, but a lot of things have happened that have made Arkansas an attractive place for folks to set up shop. So now what does all this cost? And I'm going to try to spend just a minute or two on this slide. And I'm colorblind, so I'm going to have to use my hand to indicate arrows here. But if you look at the, what is that? This one right here. Okay, what color? Ark, help me out here, will you? Sorry? The brown line. Okay, that's brown. All right. So the one that goes upwards, that is a relationship. The relationship between the price of natural gas, which I think a lot of folks are familiar with, and the cost to produce an incremental kilowatt hour of electricity. And this is really the crux of what electricity will, if you believe that we're going to move in a more clean direction, that coal probably will have a diminishing market share going forward. Nuclear is very, very expensive, and we'll probably do it just on a spotty basis, if at all. So natural gas is going to be a very, very important, play a very important role in our future electricity supply. So if you look at this equation right now, we're at like $4 on in terms of natural gas price. Most people think that $6 is roughly the price at which folks will continue to produce shale gas. That $4 is a bit of an anomaly, but let's say we're somewhere in that $4 to $8 band. That means that we get electricity that's going to cost on an incremental production basis around 3.5 to 7 cents. Okay, so that's sort of the band of wholesale electricity costs. That's just the cost. That's just the fuel cost of natural gas fed into a very economical, extremely efficient, state-of-the-art Siemens, GE, et cetera, gas turbine. Okay, so that's kind of what we wind folks are playing for. Landing somewhere in that range, we feel like we can be competitive. And again, the comparison here is between incremental gas production, okay, and wind production. On the theory, which is fairly well established, that if the wind blows really hard and the wind generators are cranking up, then the gas turbines are going to produce a little bit less, and you're going to be burning less natural gas. Okay, so that's with this calculation, I'm accounting for the fact that I'm not giving any credit to or assigning any cost to the cost of actually building the gas plant. It's really the energy that we save if we have more wind on the system, which I think is a fairly fair comparison of costs, okay? So with wind energy today, and the assumptions here are $1,500 a kW to produce wind. This really depends on capacity factor, okay? So if you're producing a wind turbine, if you put a wind turbine in eastern Arkansas, you would probably fall somewhere off the bottom of this chart. And this is on the x-axis here. This is called net capacity factor, and that's in percentages. So if you put a wind turbine in eastern Arkansas, it's not particularly windy, so it wouldn't even run 30% of the time. If you put one in northwest Oklahoma, where it's extremely windy, you're going to be up in the 48% or 44 to 48% range. So in the really windy parts of this country, you're going to be able to produce electricity at a fairly low cost. So if you say 44 to 48 cents, 48%, you ought to be able to produce wind-powered electricity in the 3-cent range, okay? Now, if you take the federal production tax credit out of the equation, okay, that's going to move you over to the, this line. What color is the line? Is that on the right? Sorry? Okay, purple. All right, we don't have a consensus on the color, but this one over here on the right that slopes down this way. I'm going to get dashed lines, I think, for my next presentation. Then you're looking at a place where wind in the really windy parts of the country wind is going to cost between 5 and 6 cents. Okay, so that's a comparison. So we get close in both scenarios. We're in the hunt with respect to where the price of natural gas drives the cost of electricity. So bear that in mind in the other comment. There may be other questions about this, and I'll try to make sure we leave time for that. But that's kind of the economics that us folks in the wind industry are playing for. So what has all this meant over the last few years? What it's meant is that as there's been a continued interest in renewable energy and due to inelastic demand from renewable portfolio standards, in 2008 we saw the point where new wind installations basically led the market in terms of new types of generation that got built in this country, okay? And again, the drivers here are on the demand side, the renewable portfolio standards, on the supply side, production incentives and technology improvements. So it's good to think, now I like to sort of, there's a lot of folks out there who think that what we're talking about here is a technological revolution, okay? So you hear, if somebody like me were giving this talk in Silicon Valley, this would all be about, you know, clean tech, and everybody would talk about clean tech and smart tech, and there's this, and Moore's law, and if we can apply Moore's law to the production of electricity. I actually think that that's not a great way to think about energy, and particularly to think about renewable energy. Because at the end of the day, with renewable energy, what we're talking about is tapping into very low-grade, widely dispersed forms of energy. So, I mean, think about it. To capture the wind in western Oklahoma, well, you guys have seen these blades going down the road. This requires a massive apparatus. Now, why does this apparatus have to be so massive? It's basically because the energy that it's trying to capture is so dispersed. And so I think that it's a lot more instructive to think about this revolution in energy in infrastructural terms. And infrastructure is big, it's bulky, it's got to go somewhere, and it's, in many ways, you know, it's harder than having a bunch of like really smart people in a lab trying to come up with some sort of technological revolution. So I think when you think renewables, think infrastructure. That's certainly the way that we think about it. So that's going to require tough decisions, because big infrastructure has footprints, and we're not always accustomed to new types of footprints. And as we make decisions about infrastructure and so on, these are the tough decisions that we have to grapple with. And at the end of the day, with respect to renewables, when we're talking about renewable electricity, we really need not just leadership from the states, which has driven the renewable energy market to date, but we're also going to need federal leadership as well. So I think that's a very important, you know, this is a public, as we think about the public policy decisions that we have to make, we're going to need a continued evolution of state and federal roles if we're going to get all this infrastructure done. So lots of people are thinking about this in, on the strength of President Bush's State of the Union address. I think it was in 2004. He said, well, we're going to get 20% of our electricity from wind energy. Those of us in the trade association, we dashed around, we put together a study, said, okay, well, the president said we can do this. Gee, we better go like figure this thing out. And one of the things, so we've got lots of folks involved from National Labs and General Electric and so on. We said, okay, what is it going to take? One of the things that it takes is a new grid and a new way of thinking about the grid. This is one of the overlays that folks came up with when they said we need a new electric grid to get to 20% wind in this country. This is another study that was done with the participation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Southwest Power Pool, Entergy as an observer, other folks who said, okay, if we want to get to 20% wind in the eastern part of the United States, this is what you need to do. And the common theme, of course, is that you have to build a lot of transmission. And it's our view that the cheapest way to do this, to get to a lot of renewables at scale, is to think about moving energy around. So you can put wind turbines in Georgia, you could put them offshore Georgia. It'll cost you around 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Or you can think about ways to move energy from the really energetic parts of the country to other parts of the country, which is sort of what we have often done when we have energy that we need in one place or another. We do it through gas pipelines, transmission lines, et cetera. The fundamental equation here, and maybe this is where the discussion should have began instead of coming around to here, is I think everybody who's been sort of west of the Ozarks understands that the middle of the country is where all the great wind resources are. And the question is, how do you get it from there to where the people are. And the chart on the left, those little bumps represent population centers, and to the right, that's a slide that shows the voltage of the U.S. grid. And the higher the voltage, the more energy that you can move. So basically, obviously, there are transmission lines in the middle of the country, but they're not at the voltages required to move massive amounts of electricity around. So what we're trying to do as a company is develop a series of transmission lines which move the energy from these really windy parts of the country to places where folks need electricity. So a lot of this is around direct current, which I'm going to sort of skip through, partly because I'm not an electrical engineer, and I'll probably make a mess of it, and we could talk all day about that. But basically, high voltage direct current, which is what we're focusing on, is the most efficient way to move a lot of electricity a very long distance, okay? So the electricity that's coming out of the wall here is AC, which means alternating current, and direct current is all the electrons flow in the same direction all the time, okay? So that's sort of the basic difference. Because of the electrical characteristics of it, it's much more efficient to move a lot of electricity a long ways with direct current lines. The disadvantage of direct current is these are, it costs a lot of money to build a station to get on the direct current line, and it costs a lot of money to build the converter station on the other end. But another way to think about this is whenever we have had the problem or the challenge of moving a lot of electricity a long ways, we have opted for direct current. And so as you all probably know, there are a lot of hydroelectric facilities in Canada which generate electricity that comes into the northeastern United States. That electricity flows on direct current lines. There are coal mines in the Dakotas that they feed what are called mine mouth coal plants, where the coal is basically burned on site and transported to Minnesota. Those are direct current lines. The tie between the Columbia River system, the Bonneville system, and Los Angeles, that's roughly a 1,000-mile line, that's a direct current line. So whenever we've had this challenge of like, how do we move a lot of power a long ways most efficiently, we end up using direct current. Now, we haven't done direct current lines in this country for some time now because during the 80s and 90s, we went to a system of moving our electricity fuel around through pipes, okay? With natural gas, the way you solve this same challenge is you build an underground pipe and you move natural gas to the source. You build a power plant close to a city, and that's where you generate your electricity. So that's how we sort of were able to avoid building a lot of, not just direct current, but transmission in general. We sort of had a pass, sort of a free pass on transmission line development in the United States for about 30 years because we figured out that we can move electricity with natural gas. So if you look at what the Chinese are doing today, they have fundamentally a very similar problem. They've got coal plants and they've got rivers in western China, and they got to get that electricity to cities. So they are building, I think it's 20 high voltage DC projects which will be able to move a tremendous amount of electricity from western China to cities like Shanghai and so on. So the big advantage is that more efficient, so you lower losses. You have a smaller footprint. As you can tell on the left side here, there's a picture of what sort of right-of-way requirements you might have to move a similar amount of energy as on the right. We are seeing some improvements in DC technology, and ultimately there's a more simpler commercial structure that you can use to support development of DC lines. And if I'm getting too far into the weeds here, or not deeply enough in the weeds, then please ask me as we move forward. So the project that we're working on today is called the Plains and Eastern Clean Line. And this project would go from western Oklahoma to Memphis. And The project would cost around $3.5 billion, about 800 miles. We would be able to deliver around 7,000 megawatts of electricity to the southeastern United States. Again, go back to the previous numbers, so 7,000 times 300, 2 million and change. Average homes, that's how much electricity we'd be able to deliver. We are just doing the transmission part of it. There's a tremendous resource in the Oklahoma Panhandle and adjacent states, but there are very few projects getting built there now because the transmission infrastructure is basically tapped out, okay? So we're talking about reaching out to a resource that's out there, not tapped today, but if the transmission infrastructure is available, then the market will respond and people will build projects so that they can move electricity on this transmission line. We think we can get all this done for under 6 cents a kilowatt hour delivered to the southeastern United States, which if you go back to some of the previous numbers, we think that's fairly competitive with the other choices that are out there. In terms of where we are on the project, we have filed before the Arkansas Public Utility Commission, or the Public Service Commission, I should say, to become a utility in Arkansas. That would put us under Arkansas's jurisdiction. Had lots of discussions with lots of folks. We're talking with folks in different counties along the way. The way you go about siting a facility like this is really, the first thing you ask yourself is, okay, where would you not do this, okay? And there's lots of areas where you would not build a transmission line. So you go out and you take all the publicly available information and you say, okay, well, clearly I'm not going there, that's a national park. Or I'm not going there because this is a wetland. Or there's a whole bunch of places that you're not going to go. So you identify those, then we've gone out to counties across Arkansas, talk to county officials, say, okay, this is the map that we know of places where we're not going to go. Now tell us about all the other places where we're not going to go. So that's how you think about siting a line like this. Ultimately, any line like this would be permitted under both federal and state authorities. So we're gearing up to go through that process. In terms of who's going to take all this electricity, the Tennessee Valley Authority has long thought of itself as a regional hub to move electricity around. So we've entered into an agreement with them, not for them to buy the capacity on the line, but rather for them to work with us on a series of technical studies to figure out, okay, what does it take to move this thing along? So we're working closely with them in that area as well. Some quick project highlights. I think I talked about most of these. We think that in addition to the economics comparison, which I just went through, that projects like this are important, after ag uses, the second largest consumer of water in this country is the production of electricity. And you don't need, well, I guess you need a very small amount of water to produce electricity with wind turbines, largely because you have to, every couple of years, you got to go in and wash the blades in case any bugs get smashed. You got, just like you do your windshield. But that's pretty much the water that you need to produce with wind power. Huge reductions in carbon dioxide. I think everybody knows that if you're serious about reducing CO2, the lowest hanging fruit is in the electric sector. After that, it gets harder and harder as you move into transportation and liquid fuel sector. Reduction of carbon there is, well, the lowest hanging fruit, I should say, is efficiency, and then the electric sector, and then the liquid fuel side is much more difficult. Big reductions in SO2, NOx, mercury, et cetera. Among other things, I think I talked a little bit about how one thinks about corridors. We've entered into an agreement here in both Arkansas and Oklahoma with the state chapters of Nature Conservancy. We're not experts. You know, we hire experts around who tell us, you know, these are the sensitive areas from an environmental perspective. But Nature Conservancy really knows this stuff well, so we've entered into an agreement with them also to get their input on that. And as a company, we feel like we're advertising a project which is environmentally beneficial. And we understand that means we'll be held to very high standards. We welcome that. That's part of the scrutiny that we feel like if you're going to advertise this, then be ready to undergo additional scrutiny, and that seems entirely fair. Oklahoma, just to give you a sense of this, could produce 10 times the total demand of the Southwest Power Pool, which is these states here that are highlighted. Lots of projects under development in the Oklahoma Panhandle. These are just numbers that show the resource, which is dramatically larger than any requirements that we might have. We think that a project like this is very beneficial to Arkansas and to customers. This helps folks meet renewable energy goals at a low cost. I think everybody in this room understands the importance that the renewable energy manufacturing sector has begun to take on in Arkansas, and you will not see factories filled making towers, blades, turbines, et cetera, unless we have the transmission infrastructure in place. So you got to have one if you want to have the other. And obviously, investments of this sort bring about additional tax revenues, jobs creation, and so on. So with that, that's a quick rundown on my thoughts on the wind energy space and renewables, and I would be delighted to take any and all questions, comments, et cetera. Yes?
Let me get a mic to you.
Yeah, let's wait for the mic.
Oh, they got it.
About
Yeah.
what does a 2-megawatt wind turbine installation cost?
Yeah, so the question is about what does a 2-megawatt wind turbine installation cost? So on the order of $3 million, fully installed, electric infrastructure, connection to the local grid, et cetera. So yeah, so a good number is $1,500 a kilowatt or 1.5 million a megawatt. Yes.
One of the issues for integrating wind into the power grid is the variability and the other resources needed to match that and that kind of thing. And with a project of this size, do you get less variability because you're consolidating a lot of producers, or do you get more variability on the other end because it's so big that the swing is large?
That's a great question. Okay, is everybody clear on that issue? So we think about this a lot. So basically, the problem with wind is we don't control it. The wind sort of does what it wants to do. What rainfall is like that as well, only you can impound water, okay, turn it into a lake, and then run it through an energy conversion system. With wind, we haven't figured out a way to sort of impound the wind and then use it when we need to. But we think that it's very advantageous to take a lot of energy from one place and move it to another. And let me just try to come up with a simple example of that. If we decided, just for grins, that we're going to go to 20% wind energy in this country, which is a pretty doable thing. I mean, you know, Denmark is there, Spain is there, Portugal, Germany's getting up there, et cetera. If we decided we wanted 20% renewable energy, that means that we could, that the Southwest Power Pool, which is Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, parts of North Texas, they would have to, and we wanted to do this in the most cost-effective way, presumably. You could put all that variability in those states, okay, which would be fairly expensive to integrate, okay, because you would be periodically knocking nuclears and hydro out of the generation stack to accommodate the wind coming in, okay? So, and your flexible units like gas-fired power plants will be working really hard to keep up with the wind. The other way you could do that is electrically take that variability and move it to another part of the country, which is what we're proposing that we do. And if you do that, then you're moving this variability, you're sort of spreading out the variability, and because the cost of managing variability goes up in a more than linear fashion, it makes sense to move that variability to another part of the country where they have resources like gas-fired power plants, hydro plants, and other facilities with swing in them. Because remember, every time any of y'all turns on or off the light, somewhere out there, there's a power plant which is responding just a tiny bit to that. So the system is designed to deal with variability. We've already got that sort of built in. And so we have some not infinite, but we have some flexibility to manage it. And if we can spread out that variability across a broader geographic area, that helps. Then on the resource side, okay, I could talk about this all day, but I'll give you a quick, if you're going to capture a lot of wind, you can spread out the turbines more, okay? And the wind moves through in fronts, and so the spreading out of the turbines helps manage the variability as well. But great question, and something that, in fact, if anybody knows like an uber smart math whiz, we're trying to hire an additional person to help us think about this. So,
okay. Got a question right back here in the back.
Yes.
I wonder if you have any comments or any information on the comparison between the economics of the wind farm system that I assume you're referring to and what we hear about today of the small wind turbines that you can install locally in a small community.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so the question is, let me make sure I understood this. So the economics of big wind farms versus small turbines. Yeah. Yeah. So generally speaking, big is better. Big, you get more energy and more economically, it's much more economical to produce wind energy at scale than with smaller turbines, which is not to say there aren't a lot of applications for small turbines, but the bigger the turbine is, the better. And a lot of that is just the physics, okay? So what happens is the higher you go in the air, the windier it gets, okay? And that's because the wind, as it moves across, it doesn't hit little obstacles. You don't have the sun heating the ground and producing thermal mixing, and that's slowing down the wind. So the higher you go, the better. And if you're going to go all the way up there, you might as well get as much wind as you can. That's kind of the dumb math on why big is a good thing.
Right here.
So in addition to the normal variability for wind as an energy source,
yeah,
is there natural disasters? Have you factored that in? Are tornadoes a threat, being in the really windy parts of the country?
Yeah.
And have you calculated that into the cost of the maintenance for the generators
right.
and the infrastructure?
So the question is around tornadoes hitting turbines. You know, there's a lot of turbines in the, up and down sort of the wind belt, and there's a lot of turbines there. As far as I know, there's not yet, it's going to happen, okay? But there's no yet recorded instance of a tornado hitting a wind turbine. We did have we did have in Iowa a measuring device that was like 200 feet tall to measure the wind, and on my buddy Dean Rundy's farm in northeast Iowa, and Dean was actually outside on his tractor as this tornado came in, and he watched this. It's not a good place to be. And he saw the tornado come through and grabbed the anemometer, this measuring gear, and that anemometer recorded 125 miles an hour, and then it sort of went kaput. So we have had them hit anemometers, but not turbines. So presumably what would happen is these machines are designed to handle wind speeds up to, there's a couple of ratios. One is a cutout speed, at which point they go, hey, it's too windy, I'm not going to run anymore, and that's around 70 miles an hour, depending on the rated, the machine. Or the other thing that, then there's a survivability number, which we try not to test, and that's in the 140 miles an hour range. I think it was Hugo that hit. Was Hugo the one that ended up in Miami? That hurricane on its way to Miami went through Jamaica and hit a wind farm, but didn't actually damage didn't do much damage. So, and I think that was like 130 miles.
We have a question in the back.
I'm just wondering what kind of early opposition you might have encountered to this project in Arkansas, or what your reception has been so far with the transmissions lines that would be here.
You know, so far, in our conversations, and we're, you know, a year and change into this, people seem to understand, okay, I'm interested in these manufacturing jobs, so I understand that that we need to build infrastructure. So I think we've had a pretty positive reception. It is a certainty that we'll run into opposition, okay? So it's our job to go out and listen to people and learn everything that we possibly can and tell our story that, yes, we're doing this. There's downside to this sort of energy infrastructure, just as there is with anything else. And listen and modify the project as best we can to accommodate any concerns that are out there. That's really, like, that is jobs like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for us. But so far, we've found a fairly welcome environment.
Yes, sir. We have a question right back here.
I've read a lot in literature. This question deals with the same one he asked. Local citizenry are generally very opposed to high voltage AC lines running through their house or near their property and so on and so forth. Do you get the same resistance to high voltage DC lines?
Okay. So you do run into opposition to transmission in general. There are concerns about EMF, okay? There are lots of studies done in the 70s and 80s which were inconclusive about the effects of transmission lines. DC lines don't have the same issues, okay? But we do create, it basically creates more of a magnetic field than a variable field. There's stuff on our website on this if you want to sort of dive into this. But the concerns appear to be lessened around or reduced around DC lines, but I'm sure this issue is going to continue to come up. And so the key is citing it, citing as carefully as we can. Yes.
My question is about, with an 800-mile long line, the uptake or maybe downtake along the way, is it more possible to do it or less so with DC versus AC? What are the factors in that issue?
So the question is, on an 800-mile line, do you have intermediate points? And the answer is you probably do not. Okay, you just pick up one place and deliver another. And that's driven by the cost of each converter station, which is on the order of $250 million. So unless you have somebody who says, hey, I want that electricity and I'll help pay for the converter station, you probably just deliver it directly.
Hi. Do you already have an agreement with any Arkansas utility to sell power?
We do not. The way most utilities purchase power is they'll go out through requests for proposals. People show up and say, I will offer you this electricity. We're a little too early to be doing that, quite honestly. We're a few years out from being able to offer such a product, but we would be happy to if anybody's here and would like to buy some electricity, we'd be happy to sell it. And we're not really the producers, we're more the transporters. We're more like the pipeline folks than the actual producers.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Michael a round of applause. Thank you.